This cat raised three orphaned bobcat kittens, but when they grew up, the unthinkable happened. The winter wind came early to Asheville that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a bite that promised snow and silence. The old pines swayed in the gusts, their branches heavy with frost, and somewhere deep in the forest, far from the nearest town, a small wooden cabin stood alone against the gathering cold. Inside, Elias Morgan sat by the window, watching the gray sky deepen, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Beside him, curled in a patch of pale sunlight that filtered through the glass, lay Mabel, a cream-colored house cat with amber eyes and a purr that filled the quiet spaces of his days. The cabin had always been still, but this year the stillness felt different, heavier somehow, as though the world were holding its breath, waiting for something to arrive. Elias had lived alone for 3 years now, ever since Eleanor passed. The cabin had been their dream once, a place to escape the noise of the world, to grow old together, surrounded by trees and sky. They had talked about filling it with rescued animals, building sanctuaries in the woods, creating a haven for creatures who had nowhere else to go. But life had a way of sweeping dreams aside, and the years had passed with only plans and promises. Never quite enough time, or money or courage to make it real. And then Eleanor was gone, and the dream went with her, leaving only Elias and Mabel and the memory of what might have been. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in early December. Delivered by a lawyer Elias barely remembered meeting. It was thick and cream-colored, sealed with red wax, and his name was written across the front in handwriting he would have recognized anywhere Eleanor's careful script. Each letter formed with the precision she brought to everything she did. His hands trembled as he opened it, careful not to tear the paper. And inside he found a single sheet covered in her words. "My dearest Elias," it began, and he could hear her voice as clearly as if she were sitting beside him. "If you still feel lonely after I'm gone, find a wounded soul to save. When you help it live again, you will live again too. We never built our sanctuary, but you can still give that gift. I know you will. All my love, always, Eleanor." He read the letter 3 times, then a fourth, his vision blurring until the words swam on the page. Mabel rubbed against his leg, sensing his distress, and he picked her up, holding her close as he had done so many times in the past 3 years. "What do you think, girl?" he whispered into her soft fur. "What would she want me to do?" Mabel purred, a low, steady sound that seemed to carry its own answer. And Elias folded the letter carefully, placing it in his shirt pocket where he could feel it against his heart. The call came the very next night, just after midnight. Elias woke to the insistent ringing of his phone, disoriented and fumbling in the darkness. The voice on the other end belonged to Rachel, a wildlife rehabilitator he had met years ago at one of Eleanor's fundraisers. "Elias, I'm sorry to call so late, but we have an emergency," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "3 bobcat kittens, maybe 8 weeks old. Their mother was killed in a trafficking bust up near the border. The kittens are in bad shape, malnourished, traumatized, barely responsive. The facility is over capacity, and we're looking for experienced hands. I know you haven't done this in a long time, but Eleanor used to say you were the best she'd ever seen with frightened animals. Can you take them? Even just for a few weeks until we find permanent placement." Elias sat up in bed, his heart pounding. Mabel stirred beside him, her eyes catching the moonlight. "3 bobcat kittens," he repeated, and even as he said the words, he felt Eleanor's letter crinkle against his chest, a wounded soul to save. Or 3. "Yes," he heard himself say. "Yes, bring them here, I'll be ready." He spent the rest of the night preparing. The cabin had a small sunroom that Eleanor had used for her plants, and he cleared it out, setting up large crates lined with soft blankets, heating lamps, shallow dishes for water and food. His hands remembered the work even though it had been decades since he'd done it, how to create a space that felt safe without feeling trapped, how to arrange hiding places and open areas, how to think like a frightened animal looking for refuge. Mabel watched from the doorway, unusually alert, her tail twitching as she followed his movements with those knowing amber eyes. Dawn was just breaking when Rachel's truck pulled up, and Elias went out to meet her, his breath fogging in the cold air. She looked exhausted, her face drawn with worry and lack of sleep. "Thank you for this," she said as she opened the back of the truck. "I wasn't sure what we were going to do." Inside were three small carriers, and through the mesh sides, Elias could see huddled shapes, small and still. "This is Jasper," Rachel said, pointing to the largest carrier. "He's got some vision problems, we think, from being kept in too bright light. This is Benny. He's the most alert but also the most scared. And this little one is Luna. She's barely eaten anything since we found them." Together they carried the carriers inside, moving slowly and speaking in low voices. In the sunroom, they opened the carriers and stepped back, giving the kittens space. For long minutes nothing happened. Then, slowly, a tawny head emerged from one carrier, Benny, his ears flat against his skull, his eyes and wild. He took 2 steps out, then froze, trembling. From another carrier came Luna, smaller and darker, moving like a shadow, her body low to the ground. Jasper stayed hidden, only the tip of his tail visible. "Give them time," Rachel said softly. "They've been through hell." She left food and medication instructions, promised to check in, and then she was gone. And Elias was alone with 3 terrified bobcat kittens who wanted nothing to do with him. The first days were difficult. The kittens wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink, barely moved except to huddle together in the darkest corner of the room. Elias sat outside the sunroom for hours, reading aloud from the newspaper, speaking softly, just letting them get used to his presence. He felt useless, helpless, watching them suffer and not knowing how to reach them. And then, on the 3rd morning, something changed. He woke to find Mabel sitting outside the sunroom door, staring intently through the glass. This wasn't unusual. She had been fascinated by the new arrivals from the beginning, sitting vigil for hours. But this morning was different. As Elias approached, he saw that she had brought something with her, an old plush mouse, gray and worn, one of her favorite toys from years ago. It had belonged to her when she was younger, when Eleanor was still alive, when Mabel had briefly had kittens of her own that didn't survive. She hadn't played with it in years, but now she held it gently in her mouth. And as Elias watched, she pawed at the door, asking to be let in. "You want to meet them, girl?" Elias asked, uncertain. Mabel meowed, insistent, and against his better judgment. He opened the door just wide enough for her to slip through. She moved slowly, deliberately, her body low and non-threatening. The 3 bobcat kittens froze, watching her. Mabel didn't approach them directly. Instead, she walked to the middle of the room and carefully placed the plush mouse on the floor. Then she backed away and sat down, her tail wrapped around her paws, and simply waited. Minutes passed. Then Benny, the boldest of the 3, crept forward. He sniffed the air, his whiskers twitching, his eyes fixed on Mabel. She didn't move, didn't even blink. Benny reached the mouse, touched it with one paw, then grabbed it in his mouth and retreated to his corner. Mabel's tail twitched one satisfaction. Elias thawed, and she began to purr, a low rumbling sound that filled the room. That was the turning point. Over the next days, Mabel became a constant presence in the sunroom, and the kittens slowly began to accept her. She never pushed, never invaded their space without invitation, but she was always there, a calm and steady presence in their chaotic world. Benny was the first to fully trust her, crawling close to sleep against her warm body. Then Luna, the fragile one who barely seemed to exist, began to follow Mabel with her eyes. And one evening, Elias found them curled together, Luna's head resting on Mabel's back, both of them breathing in perfect synchrony. Jasper took longer. His vision was slowly improving, but he was cautious, hanging back while his siblings explored. Mabel seemed to understand this, and she never forced interaction. Instead, she would position herself where he could see her easily, and gradually he began to relax in her presence. One morning, Elias entered the sunroom to find Jasper following Mabel around the perimeter of the room, matching her pace exactly, learning the space through her confident movements. As the kittens grew stronger, their personalities emerged. Benny was playful and curious, always the first to investigate new objects or sounds. Luna was gentle and observant, watching everything with those huge dark eyes. Jasper was thoughtful, cautious, but deeply affectionate once he decided to trust. They began to eat regularly, their coats growing glossy, their movements more fluid, and through it all, Mabel mothered them with a patience and wisdom that astonished Elias. He started keeping an audio journal, recording observations and stories each evening. It began as a way to process his thoughts, but he found himself speaking as though Eleanor could hear him, telling her about the day's small victories and setbacks. "Eleanor, you should have seen it today," he'd say, his voice catching. "Luna actually played, really played, chasing a leaf that blew into the room. She looked so happy, so alive. I think this is what you meant, about saving them and being saved." Sometimes Mabel would jump onto his lap while he recorded, purring loudly enough that the microphone picked it up, and he would laugh and tell Eleanor about that too. His granddaughter Annie, who was 17 and living with her parents in Charlotte, heard one of the recordings when Elias accidentally sent it to the family group chat. She called him immediately, her voice thick with tears. "Grandpa, that was beautiful," she said. "Have you thought about sharing these like a podcast or something? People need to hear this story." Elias was surprised by the suggestion, but Annie was persistent, and eventually he agreed to let her help him set up a simple audio blog. Within weeks, they had hundreds of listeners, people from all over the world following the story of three orphaned bobcat kittens and the house cat who became their mother. Annie also sent him a package, a collection of children's books about animals, with a note that said, "Read to them. It helped me when I was scared." And so Elias began a new evening ritual. After dinner, he would sit in the sunroom with a book, and the three kittens would gather around. Mabel sitting like a queen in the center, and he would read aloud. Sometimes it was The Wind in the Willows, sometimes Charlotte's Web, sometimes simple picture books about forest animals. The kittens would watch his face as he read, their eyes tracking his movements, and occasionally one would chirp softly as though commenting on the story. One particularly cold night, Elias woke to strange sounds from the sunroom. Luna, crying in her sleep, her body twitching with nightmare tremors. Before he could get up, he saw Mabel cross the room in the moonlight. She pressed her body against Luna's, wrapping around the frightened kitten, and began to purr, not her usual contented rumble, but a deeper, more resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through both their bodies. Luna's cries quieted, her breathing steadied, and within minutes she was sleeping peacefully again. Elias stood in the doorway, watching, and felt something crack open in his chest. Grief. Yes, but also gratitude, awe, love. The weeks turned into months, and winter deepened its hold on the mountains. A particularly fierce snowstorm hit in January, and Elias, who had been feeling off for days, collapsed in the kitchen. He wasn't sure how long he lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness. But when he finally managed to pull himself up and stumble to his bedroom, he found he couldn't get warm, couldn't stop shaking. He fell onto the bed and into a deep, feverish sleep. When he woke, it was dark, and for a moment he was confused, disoriented. Then he became aware of weight on his chest, around his legs, pressed against his side. He turned his head and saw, in the dim light from the hallway, all three bobcat kittens arranged around and on him, their bodies warm and still. Mabel sat on his chest, her face close to his, purring steadily. They had somehow opened the door, or perhaps he had left it ajar and they had come to him, offering the same comfort and care he had given them. Tears leaked from the corners of his eyes as he lay there, surrounded by the creatures he had saved, who were now saving him in return. As he recovered over the following days, Annie had called when he didn't answer his phone and sent a neighbor to check on him. Elias found himself thinking more about Eleanor, about their young selves and the dreams they had shared. He remembered the first animal they had rescued together, a scrawny stray cat with a torn ear and infected wounds. Eleanor had been so nervous, her hands shaking as she cleaned and stitched, but so determined. "We're going to save so many more," she had promised him that night, her eyes bright with purpose. "We're going to build something beautiful." They had been 23 years old when newly married, full of plans they never quite managed to fulfill, until now. The bobcat kittens continued to grow, and soon the sunroom was too small for their increasingly energetic play. Elias spent February building an expanded enclosure, connecting the sunroom to a screened outdoor area with climbing structures, logs, platforms at varying heights. Mabel supervised the construction, and when it was finished, she was the first to explore, leading the kittens up ramps and across bridges, showing them how to climb, how to jump, how to navigate their new world. She taught them in ways that amazed Elias. She would hide the plush mouse in different locations, encouraging them to hunt for it, developing their natural stalking behaviors. She showed them how to groom themselves properly, sitting patiently while they copied her movements, licking paws and washing faces. At night, she would make rounds, checking on each kitten, cleaning their ears, touching noses with them. Sometimes she would simply lie in the middle of the enclosure, doing nothing, just being present, and the kittens would pile around her, soaking up her calm certainty. The veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, came monthly to check on the kittens' progress and administer vaccinations. On one such visit, the kittens were terrified by the stranger and the unfamiliar equipment. They huddled in the farthest corner, hissing and spitting. Elias had closed off Mabel in the house for the visit, worried she might get hurt in the chaos, but she could clearly hear what was happening. When he checked on her, he found her sitting at the door that led to the enclosure, her whole body tense, her eyes fixed on the glass, watching everything. After the vet left and the kittens were still agitated, Elias opened the door and Mabel rushed in. Luna immediately grabbed the plush mouse which had been knocked aside during the examination and carried it carefully to Mabel, placing it at her feet. It was an offering. Oh, thank you. An acknowledgement of protection given even from a distance. As winter began to soften into early spring, Jasper's vision had improved dramatically. And one afternoon, Elias found him perched on the highest platform in the enclosure, staring out through the screening toward the distant mountains. His siblings joined him, and then Mabel, and the four of them sat in a row, silhouetted against the sunset, watching the sky turn gold and pink and purple. Elias grabbed his camera, but he didn't need a photograph to remember the image. It was already burned into his heart, a living portrait of the family they had become. During this time, Elias also reconnected with Martha, one of Eleanor's oldest friends. Martha had lived alone for 15 years, since her husband died, and she rarely left her house anymore. But when she heard about the bobcat kittens Annie had shared the audio blog with her, she called Elias and asked if she could visit. "I want to see what Eleanor started," she said, her voice small over the phone. "I want to see something hopeful." She came on a Saturday, bringing homemade apple pie, and she cried when she met Mabel and the kittens. Afterward, she and Elias sat at the kitchen table drinking tea, and Martha pulled out a bundle of letters correspondence between her and Eleanor from years ago. They read them together, laughing and crying, remembering a woman they both loved and missed. Martha started coming every week, and slowly her own isolation began to crack, light seeping through. But as March arrived, so did the inevitable conversation Elias had been dreading. Rachel called to say that a spot had opened at a larger wildlife sanctuary, one with proper facilities for growing bobcats, one that could eventually prepare them for potential release into the wild. "They're getting too big, Elias," she said gently. "You've done an incredible job, but they need more space, more specialized care. It's time." Elias knew she was right. He had always known this day would come, but knowing didn't make it easier. That night, he sat in the enclosure with Mabel and the three kittens, watching them play and roughhouse, their bodies sleek and strong now, their eyes bright with health and life. Jasper could see almost normally. Benny was confident and bold. Luna had blossomed into a graceful, curious young bobcat. They were ready. He was not. He found himself talking to Eleanor in his mind, as he had done so often since she died. "I'm afraid of losing them," he whispered into the darkness. "I'm afraid of being alone again, of going back to that silence. But I know that love means letting go. You taught me that. True love wants what's best for them, not what's easiest for me." The morning of the transfer, Elias woke early. He sat with the kittens one last time, memorizing every detail, the pattern of spots on Luna's face, the way Benny's left ear had a small notch from an old injury, the depth of trust in Jasper's eyes. And then he saw Luna do something extraordinary. She picked up the old plush mouse, Mabel's mouse, which had been with them through everything, and carried it carefully to Mabel's favorite sleeping spot. She placed it in the center of the blanket, then turned and pressed her forehead against Mabel's, holding the position for a long moment. Jasper and Benny joined, the three siblings saying goodbye to their surrogate mother in the only way they knew how. Elias couldn't speak. His throat was too tight, his eyes too blurred. He picked up Mabel and held her close, feeling her purr against his chest, and watched as Rachel and her team carefully guided the three bobcats into transport carriers. The kittens went quietly, calmly, without the terror they had shown when they first arrived. They trusted humans now, trusted the world a little more, and that trust was a gift Mabel and Elias had given them together. For weeks after they left, the cabin felt empty again. Elias found himself avoiding the enclosure, unable to face the vacant spaces where the kittens used to play. But Mabel seemed to understand in her mysterious way that this was the right thing, the necessary thing. She stayed close to Elias, purring whenever he picked her up, sleeping on his pillow at night, reminding him that he wasn't alone, that they had work yet to do. This trail camera Elias had set up near the cabin's perimeter captured something unexpected one evening in late March. Three bobcat shapes, larger now than when they left, standing on a hill about 50 yards from the cabin. They were just standing there, still and silent, facing the porch. Elias and Mabel went outside, and for several minutes, they all simply looked at each other across the distance. Elias didn't call out, didn't try to approach. This was a wild goodbye, a final acknowledgement, and it needed to be on the bobcat's terms. After a few minutes, the three shapes turned and melted back into the forest, and Elias knew he wouldn't see them again. Or at least, not like this. But the story wasn't over. Rachel called in April with another case of feral kitten, maybe 5 weeks old, found abandoned in a parking lot, terrified of all humans, hissing and spitting at anyone who came near. "I know you're probably exhausted," Rachel said, "but would you consider, Mabel has such a gift." Elias looked at Mabel, who was sitting in a patch of sunlight, cleaning her paws. "What do you think, girl?" he asked, ready to teach another one. Mabel looked up at him with those knowing amber eyes, and he could have sworn she smiled. The feral kitten arrived that evening, a tiny ball of gray fur and fury. They set up a crate in the sunroom, and Mabel immediately took up her post beside it. For the entire first night, she simply sat there, not approaching, not forcing anything, just being present. The kitten hissed and growled from inside the crate, but Mabel's calm never wavered. By the third day, the kitten had stopped hissing. By the fifth day, it ventured out of the crate. By the end of the week, it was sleeping curled against Mabel's belly. Elias watched the transformation and smiled through his tears. "Another generation saved," he whispered. Word of Mabel's gift spread through the rehabilitation network, and over the following months, more cases came, frightened animals who needed more than medical care, who needed to remember how to trust. A young raccoon with a broken leg, twin fox kits orphaned by a car accident, a hawk with a damaged wing. Not all stayed long, and not all survived, but each one was touched by Mabel's patient wisdom. Each one learned from her that the world could be safe, that not all humans meant harm, that healing was possible. Elias began creating a memorial garden on the property, a clearing in the woods that he called the Heart Clearing. For Eleanor, he planted lavender, her favorite flower, arranging the plants in a large heart shape. For Mabel, he scattered seeds for wild daisies, flowers that would spread and bloom freely, untamed. And for Jasper, Benny, and Luna, he planted 3 young mountain ash saplings, trees that would grow tall and strong, providing shelter and food for wildlife for generations to come. Each year he added more plants, more trees, creating a living memorial that grew and changed with the seasons. Annie graduated high school that spring and announced her intention to study wildlife biology in college because of you and Mabel. She told Elias when she came to visit, because you showed me that one person can make a difference, that love can cross any boundary. She spent her summer at the cabin, helping Elias with the growing number of rescue cases, learning from him and from Mabel, building the skills she would need for her chosen career. In July, Elias had to go to the hospital for a minor surgery routine. The doctors assured him, but it required an overnight stay. Annie took care of Mabel and the current rescues a young opossum and a pair of injured squirrels. But that night, the trail camera captured something that made Annie call Elias in his hospital room, her voice shaking with wonder. Luna had returned. She stood in the snow, summer snow, a freak storm that had blown down from the mountains in front of the cabin, completely still for almost 3 hours. She didn't approach the door, didn't try to get in, just stood there, a silent vigil. And then, just before dawn, she turned and vanished back into the forest. "No one teaches wild animals to do that," Annie said, wonder in her voice. Was it instinct or was it family? Elias didn't know the answer. Perhaps there wasn't one. Perhaps some bonds transcended explanation, existed in a space beyond words where love and memory and gratitude all tangled together into something that looked like magic, but was really just the truth of connection, the reality of hearts that had touched and been forever changed. Years passed. Annie graduated college and took a job with a major conservation organization. She gave talks around the country about wildlife rehabilitation, about the importance of individual animals, about the lessons taught by an elderly house cat named Mabel. She wrote Elias letters that he kept in a special box, reading them on difficult days. "Thank you, Grandpa," one letter said, "and thank Mabel for teaching me that love knows no boundaries, that family isn't always blood, that the smallest acts of kindness can change the world." Elias continued his work, expanding the enclosures, taking in more cases, building the sanctuary that he and Eleanor had once dreamed of. Martha became his partner in the work, handling fundraising and communications while he managed the day-to-day care. The audio blog grew into a modest podcast with thousands of regular listeners who followed the stories of each new rescue. People sent donations, supplies, letters of encouragement. The cabin that had been so silent, so lonely, became a place of constant activity and purpose. Mabel aged gracefully, moving a little slower, sleeping a little more, but never losing her essential gift for calming frightened souls. Each new rescue benefited from her presence, her wisdom, her infinite patience. She became something of a legend in rehabilitation circles, the mother cat, they called her, the house cat who could gentle the wildest heart. On a late winter afternoon, 8 years after the bobcat kittens first arrived, Elias and Mabel and Annie sat on the cabin porch wrapped in blankets, watching the sun set over the mountains. The air was cold but clear, and the trees stood black against the golden sky. And there, at the edge of the forest, 4 shapes appeared, 3 large bobcats, unmistakably Jasper, Benny and Luna, full grown now and magnificent, and a fourth, smaller shape, a kit, Luna's kit. They stood on the snow, perfectly still, looking toward the cabin. Elias felt Annie's hand grip his arm, felt Mabel tense slightly in his lap. No one moved, no one spoke. For several long minutes, they simply existed together in that moment, connected across the distance, family in all the ways that mattered. Then, as if some signal had been given, the 4 bobcats turned as one and disappeared into the darkening forest. Elias heard Annie crying softly beside him, felt his own tears cooling on his cheeks. Mabel purred, a steady rumbling that seemed to contain all the love and loss and gratitude of the past 8 years. "They came to show you," Annie whispered, "to show you Luna's baby, to show you that the family continues." Elias nodded, unable to speak. He thought of Eleanor, of her letter, of her certainty that saving a wounded soul would save him too. She had been right. As always, the bobcat kittens hadn't just survived, they had thrived, had returned to the wild, had created new life. And in saving them, Elias had found his own way back to life, had built the sanctuary they had dreamed of, had learned that love doesn't end with death or distance, but continues, transforms, finds new expressions in each act of care and courage. The wind moved through the memorial garden, carrying the scent of lavender even in winter, somehow preserved in the cold air. Mabel's purr grew louder, a sound of contentment and completion. And somewhere in the darkening forest, a bobcat kit learned to hunt from its mother, part of an unbroken chain of life and love that stretched back to a cream-colored house cat who had taught three orphaned kittens how to trust again. In the cabin, warmth glowed from the windows, smoke curled from the chimney, and inside, through one, work continued a new fawn recovering from a car accident, a young bobcat learning to climb, a barn owl with a healing wing. The sanctuary Eleanor had envisioned lived and breathed, grew and evolved, saved and was saved in return. And through it all, Mabel watched over them with her amber eyes, the heart and soul of a place where wounded creatures learned to believe in tomorrow, where silence transformed into purpose, where an old man's grief became an endless wellspring of love. The mother cat, the teacher, the guardian of second chances, living proof that the smallest among us can carry the greatest gifts. That healing flows both ways, and that when we save a life, we save ourselves. Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.